Never before have we realized the intricacies of our global supply chains. It is therefore my great pleasure to introduce you to Peter Zeihan, a geopolitical strategist, which is his fancy way of saying he helps people understand how the world works. Peter combines an expert understanding of demography, economics, energy, politics, technology, and security to help clients best prepare for an uncertain future. Over the course of his career, Peter has worked for the U.S. State Department in Australia, the DC think tank community, and helped develop analytical models for Stratfor, one of the world's premier private intelligence companies. Peter founded his own firm, Zihan on Geopolitics, in 2012 in order to provide a select group of clients with direct, custom analytical products. Today, those clients represent a vast array of sectors, including energy majors, financial institutions, business associations, agricultural interests, universities, and the U.S. military. He is a critically acclaimed author, and he has a keen eye that he looks towards what will drive tomorrow's headlines. His irreverent approach transforms topics that are normally dense and heavy into accessible, relevant takeaways for audiences of all types. Peter's third book, Disunited Nations, was published earlier this year. Welcome, Peter. Thank you for being here with us today.
It's a pleasure to be here, although here is in Colorado. I think the best way to start out is to give you a quick 30-second view of why things are the way they are. At the end of World War II, Americans were convinced that they were about to be in a showdown with none other than Joseph Stalin. And we decided that we needed an array of allies, not to stand with us or stand behind us, but to stand in front of us, between us and the Soviets. As a result, we crafted what we now think of as the global order of globalization, where the United States will use its Navy to patrol the global oceans for anyone, so that everyone can ship anything from anywhere to anywhere else without having to worry about piracy or privateering. And that ultimately gave us this map. Now, the light blue, those are the countries that we cared about here in the United States before World War II. And the green were the new allies in this new global order, the first global order. But everyone else was on the outside. In fact, most of those red countries were on the other side. And so, what we did bit by bit from 1946 until the fall of the Berlin Wall is we invited other countries to join. And those are the yellows, and you'll notice that involves the Chinese. Now, the countries that benefited the most from this new structure were those that were either too resource poor to be able to challenge the major naval powers, countries like Germany, or those who had weak geographies that made them prey to those empires, places like China. And so, with the global order, for the first time in their existence, China and countries like them could access resources and markets without needing to secure them militarily. And that changed everything. That gave us the world that we know. But that world is over. Remember, this was a security program. It ended at the end of the Cold War in 1989. And since then, the Americans have been steadily reducing their troops ever since. We had a hiccup when it came to 9/11 and the following wars in the Middle East, but for the most part, the Americans have come home. Our troop deployments globally are now at the lowest level since the 1920s. And everything that's left of the system, everything that's left of the world that we think that we know, is simply running on inertia. And perhaps the worst part for the non Americans in the world is that the US really doesn't care. And it has to do with who might be able to pick up the mantle. Now, what we have here are two carriers. The one on the left is a supercarrier, the one on the right is a traditional jump carrier. On the deep blue sea, without support from land based aircraft, it takes 7 jump carriers to fight off a single supercarrier. Now, there are 11 jump carriers, excuse me, there are 21 jump carriers in the world, 11 of which are American. There are 11 supercarriers in the world. Every single one of them is American, which means that if you sailed the entire navy of the rest of the world against the United States, it would only take 1, maybe 2 aircraft carrier battle groups to carry the day for the Americans. There is no country that this century can hope to displace the Americans on the waves. And the United States is the only country that can make the system work. But it's also the only country that doesn't need it to work. The United States designed the global system to fight a war. It did not do so as an economic investment. And Americans have collectively decided that our security issues are local and regional, not global. So we're out, which means that the global system has lost its designer, its broker, its investor, and its protector. And that, all of that, is just the first factor. Geopolitically speaking, the world that we know is artificial. It's ending, and it's bending back towards something that, historically speaking, is a lot more normal. That means less interaction. That means less trade. That means financial shortages. That means less integration. That means less growth. And remember, that's just the first point. Second, you have to look at demographics. Now, this is the demographic of Mexico. What we've got here are children on the bottom, young adults, mature adults, retirees at the top, men on one side, women on the other. Mortality tends to build it into a pyramid. Now, when American business leaders and politicians look at something like the Mexican demography, we kind of like what we see because all those young people are relatively low down on the value added scale. They're relatively new to their jobs. They don't add a lot of value to their products. That's not what Americans are good at. We're very highly educated. We're very highly motivated. We're very high value added workers. And so the propensity to trade between low end Mexican manufacturing and assembly and high end American manufacturing and design is huge. It's an excellent relationship. It's the most robust trade relationship in the world. Second, Mexicans are young. And when you're below roughly age 40, it's all about the spending, buying houses, buying cars, raising kids, spend, 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 which means that Mexicans absorb a lot of American imports. This is a beautiful relationship, honestly, from an economic point of view, not that there aren't complications. But again, this is what we look for in a trading partner. And this is not. The Koreans had a baby bust back in the 1980s. They never recovered, which means they've got a lot of people aged 40 to 60, which means these people have already sent their kids on. They're off at college or beyond. They're not buying a lot anymore. And because they've been in their jobs for 20, 30, 40 years, they're very high value added. They're going head to head with the American workforce. So a trade relationship with a country like South Korea is very problematic. Now, for the last 25 years, 40 years, from 1980 to roughly 2015, the world demographically was in a beautiful moment. All of the world's economies were either consumption led like Mexico's or export led like South Korea. And so there was a good balance of trade, a lot of economic activity, a lot of things flying back and forth across the oceans. What we have here are the demographic pictures of some of the major economies in the year 2000. It was a perfect balance, excellent for globalization. But 20 years later, we're all 20 years older, and that balance is gone. A lot of those consumption led economies have aged into being export led, and a lot of those export led economies are aging into post growth. We are no longer in a system where everything's in balance. The global demographic of high consumption was already ending, and courtesy of COVID, it's likely already over. As to the export led economies, they're aging into mass retirement, they're post growth. The year 2022 is the year that most of the advanced world shifts from being export led to post growth. And COVID has robbed us of the time we had left to prepare for that transition. Now, the United States isn't cleanly in one of those two categories. Its demographics have slimmed, but it hasn't inverted. Now, our baby boomers are still aging into mass retirement, and just coincidentally, that still happens in the year 2022, along with the rest of the advanced world. But America has something going for it that the rest of the advanced world doesn't. Millennials. We might think of them as annoying, and we might not like their bedazzled flip flops or all those goddamn scooters, but they exist and they're having children and they're buying homes. And from a consumption point of view, that makes them the single largest market on this planet. And they will remain the single largest market on this planet for at least another 15 years. I hate to say it, but millennials may just save us all. Because I need to give you an idea of just how sharp this is going to be. Let me give you an idea of scale. Now, in 2020, the United States is the only large consumption-led economy that's going to remain a large consumption-led economy in 2030. What I've done here is I've stacked up all of the world's 100 largest economies, which make up 95% of global economic activity. And in the first column, you can see where everybody is now. And in the second column, you can see where everybody will be in 10 years. Now, there's 1,000 ways that we could do this and quibble with some of the specifics. So this is just using the data we have available today. But if you look at where the export-led economies are, they age into obsolescence. That entire category goes away. Now, right now, Japan, the world's largest and fastest aging demography, the world's largest collection of old folks and the fastest aging demography, it's really the only post-growth economy we have. But by the time we get to 2030, not only will the Chinese and the Europeans have joined them, but we will, as a planet, have aged past the point where the economic structure of today is even theoretically possible. And this was all before COVID took away a year or two of consumption and a year or two of production and more than a year or two of financial capacity. We will never return to where we were in 2019. That model's gone. Betting on globalization now is like betting on buggy whips when the Model T started rolling off the line. That era is over. Going to something different, or perhaps something a lot older. You remove the Americans from the equation. You let the chips fall where they may. You'll get a series of conflicts in places that the Americans used to hold together. These are the places where I expect them to be most explosive. Now, for those of you who know your world history, you'll recognize that these are the places that have seen the greatest wars in the history of our species. And for those of you who know economic history, you will recognize these zones as the areas that have seen the greatest economic growth since 1945. There's no coincidence. That's because of the order. The Americans forced everyone to be on the same side and outlawed war among the various order members so that we were all on the same side against the Soviets. But with the Americans gone, history reasserts. And these zones are responsible for 3/4 of global energy shipments, agricultural shipments, and manufacturing supply chain steps. This is the end of the world that we know. Now, the gentleman who's kind of midwifing this process is this guy. This is Robert Lightheider. He's the U.S. Trade Representative. He's responsible for enforcing and negotiating every trade deal we have. Now, this is not his first stint in government. He also worked for Team Reagan back during the 1980s. Now, if you dial back to the 1980s, the Cold War was running hot and heavy. We actually had a nuclear scare over Berlin in 1983. And a lot of the allies were doing things that the Reagan administration was not overly fond of. Specifically, the Germans, the French, the Japanese, they were all intervening egregiously in currency markets to push down the value of their currencies versus the US dollar so they could export more to the American market. Kind of violated the spirit of the order, but Reagan really needed everyone lined up shoulder to shoulder with us against the Soviets, so he was willing to look the other way. But fast forward to 1985. Gorbachev had risen to power. The Cold War was winding down. The Reykjavik summit was a wild success. So Team Reagan pulled the allies together at the Plaza Hotel in New York and said, look, we see what you've been doing. You're going to stop. You're going to stop today. Because if you do not, the United States will remove itself from the global order and you can deal with the Soviets yourself. The intimidation worked. Within 6 months, the Allies not only stopped the intervention, they reversed it. And within 6 months, the US dollar had dropped by half. Now, Robert Lightheider here, he was the Reagan administration's hatchet man assigned to Tokyo to make sure that he did not renege on the deal. And whenever he got his marching orders, he'd walk into the Ministry of Finance, lay out the American position, and then when it was time for the Japanese to issue the rebuttal, he'd take off his translator microphone and disassemble it on the desk and have a little GI Joe war pieces. When the Japanese were finished, he'd scoop it back together, put it up, put it back on, and say, well, that was riveting. But we're going to do it my way, right? When he accepts a job, he makes sure he has all of the cards. He makes sure he has political cover, and then he doesn't negotiate. He forces his solution on whoever's on the other side of the table. This is the guy who's been in charge of every trade talk the United States has engaged in for the last 3.5 years. And he's generated results. These are the 5 deals that matter to the United States: Korea, Japan, Canada, Mexico, and the United Kingdom. And these are countries that honestly don't have a lot of choice. South Korea doesn't exist without American security overwatch. They had to capitulate on every point of the program. Canada has no other options, and it can't pivot to another trading partner. The United Kingdom destroyed its links to the European Union, so it's a deal on Washington's terms or an economic depression. We'll see that deal happen later this year. And it has been seared into the collective memory of Japan just what happens when the United States turns hostile. Of these 5, only Mexico has any wiggle room because Mexico has things that the United States wants: a young demographic, a growing market, and a complementary economic system. So, with the exception of the deal with the United Kingdom, which will happen later this year, deals with these countries aren't simply sewn up, they've already been implemented. It's done. And that just leaves China. Now, I could give you 30, 40 reasons why China will not be in existence as a unified nation state a decade from now. But really, this is the single most important. It's the islands that roughly parallel the Chinese coast: Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia, Singapore. It's not just that they're all allies, although they are. It's that they form something that the Chinese call the first island chain. And the Chinese have never, in any period of their 3,500-year-long history, ever been able to penetrate that chain in a commercial manner and integrate economically with the world beyond. There is one exception today under the order, because the Americans have forced everyone to be on the same side. But if you remove the Americans from the equation, this region goes back being more antagonistic. And China has lacked its entire history the military capacity to enforce any sort of globe spanning trade system. In fact, any sort of East Asian centric trade system. All the Americans have to do, if the goal really is to destroy China, is go home. Now, I said there are 30 to 40 reasons. I'm going to give you a couple more. Let's look at demographics. Now, this is the Chinese demographic in 1980. You'll notice it's very young. And when China joined the order after Nixon went to China, they were able to produce goods at a price that no one could compete with because they had so many young people, supply and demand. But if you fast forward 20 years, it looks a little bit different. Between 1980 and 2015, China experienced the perfect demographic moment. And there were 3 pieces to it. First, they had lots of young people, so low production costs. Well, that was over 20 years ago. And Chinese labor costs since 2000 have increased by more than a factor of 10. Second, Chinese young adults had few kids with higher spending in the short run. That's the Chinese boom that we've seen these last 10 years, but that's nearly over. There's a consumption trough coming. And third, China cannibalized the countryside to fuel urban activity, and that's over. The countryside is now nearly empty of people of reproductive age. In many ways, the Chinese development story is a bit like what happened here in the United States with the move from the farm to the city. But whereas in the United States it happened over 2 centuries, in China it happened in just 1 generation. So here's the Chinese demography today. They are enjoying one last burst of consumption before that one block of population ages into not being significant consumers in the future. They've not only aged out of their beautiful demographic moment, the Chinese have aged past the point of demographic recovery. And it shows up in their labor data. These are several Southeast Asian countries that I think will actually do pretty well in the world we're moving into. This is Mexico, a country with very competitive. And here's the labor cost in the People's Republic of China. They have simply moved past the point where they can participate in a meaningful trade system. In fact, if you look at the consumption numbers, it's really bad. Here is domestic car sales month by month from a year earlier. Now, that big drop off in January of 2000, that's from the coronavirus pandemic. That is what you would expect when people don't go outside, they don't buy cars. That's not what I talk about. What I'm talking about when I'm talking about the trouble that China is in. I'm looking at the 2 years previous. Look at how negative that is. Now, this is pre COVID. This is in 2019. This is in 2018. This is when the big story was how China was going to take over everyone and rule the world and be a big consumption led economy. It's just that it's not true. Even within their own system, even with their own data, China has already gone terminal. They also have a shorter term problem: trade talks. Look who's there. Lightheiser has been in charge of all the trade talks everywhere in the world, wherever they happen to be. Now, this is the guy who wrote the World Trade Organization Charter. This is arguably the most free trade person in the American political establishment today. And if you look at what might happen after November, whether it's Trump or Biden, the Chinese cannot count on anything getting easier, because either Trump will win, in which case Lighthizer only has one country to focus on, or Biden will win. And Biden has personally called President Xi Jinping a thug and has advocated a series of anti Chinese trade policies that are far more strict than what we're facing today. 2019 was as good as it was going to get. To put this more short term, this gentleman, Ambassador Branstad from Iowa, used to be the governor. He is arguably the person in the United States most capable of generating a positive working relationship with the Chinese, because he's on a first name basis with President Xi Jinping of China. Branstad and Xi have been friends since they first met in 1985. And so when Trump appointed Branstad to be ambassador, everybody assumed that things were going to go swimmingly. Well, after months of relations deteriorating, Branstad last week wrote an op ed about how the relationship was falling apart and what the Chinese had done to push it in that direction. The Chinese, of course, immediately censored the document, and Branstad resigned this Monday morning. Whoever replaces him is going to be a China hawk, not a China dove. Okay, let's talk about some of the economic sectors so you have an idea of what's coming down the pipe in that front. Now, this is what we call the total private credit curve. This is all private credit from all sources to all sources: mortgages, credit cards, stocks, everything. The only thing that is not included is interbank lending. So if one bank is lending overnight window monies to another bank, that's not there, but everything else. Now, from the start of this chart in 2000 to the middle in 2008, that line going up, that is the subprime crisis in a single graphic. We doubled total private credit in the United States in 2 years. Excuse me, in 7 years. It was too much. It was too fast. As a result, we had a bubble. It burst. We had a recession. In the ensuing year and a half, 5% came off of headline GDP. Since then, private credit growth has rebounded, and we're back to something much more similar to the century average. This is our baseline. Now, the same data, but this time in relative terms instead of absolute. So that little bump in the middle, again, that's a doubling. Here's the Eurozone. In the time the United States doubled total credit, the Europeans tripled it. As a result, the European financial crisis hit harder, lasted longer. Several countries, such as Italy, still haven't recovered to where they were in 2007. And because of COVID and demographics, they probably never will. Here's Greece: sevenfold increase of credit in 7 years. And they're not done. Before COVID came, they were looking at least another 20% contraction on top of the 40% they had already suffered. Because of COVID, they will never recover. Here's Brazil. This is what a lost decade looks like, assuming you get the politics right. I don't know how many of you follow Brazilian politics. Well, actually, all of you should follow Brazilian politics. I mean, do you like Game of Thrones, Maury Povich, the impeachment hearings? Drama, 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 drama. You've got to get into Brazilian politics. Holy crap! They had a presidential election a couple of years ago, and the final two guys. One guy was campaigning from prison where he had been convicted of corruption, because in Brazil you can run for office from prison. You just can't, be president. And then the guy who won at his last big public rally said that the real problem with those Nazis is that they're just too soft on their domestic opponents. Wow. So this honestly is probably 2 lost decades. And for a country like Brazil that is so dependent on imported capital, coronavirus means that they're probably not going to return to 2019 ever either. Here we have India in purple and Turkey in black, two countries that are still early in the process. Now, both of these countries have already elected to office for multiple terms ethno nationalist leaders who have no problem using state resources to spawn race riots on purpose in order to get a bump in the polls from their more reactionary supporters. I think Trump's bad. They have nothing on these two. Now, you'll notice that the Turkish line, the black one, actually dipped last year. Why? Well, that was the start of their financial correction. What also happened last year? The Turks invaded Syria and Iraq. It was a distraction play. And then here's the People's Republic of China. And let me bring that down for you. Yeah. China is now the most over-credited country in human history in both relative and absolute terms. It is Enron in nation state form. Every system that we know, every company that has ever followed this model of force fed capital has eventually collapsed. It's just a question how bad it will be. And China's now pushed this further and harder than anyone else. So it's going to be historically unique. Now, the point of all of this is that there's a large series of major financial crises that aren't just inevitable, some of them might actually be imminent. That's a lot of money that's going to be looking for a safer location. What does foreign money want? Rule of law, hard fiscal assets, implicit government guarantees, dividends. If you're looking to tap global credit for local development, there will never be a better time than right now. All right, that's finance. Let's look at energy. What we've got here is a price breakdown. So the broader the bar, the greater the volume of crude oil that comes out of the various country for export. The taller the bar, the greater the cost of producing the crude. Now, this is data from 8 years ago, 2012. And back then, US shale was the most expensive crude in the world to produce. And we only kicked out about 4 million barrels a day. That's about Iran at its peak. Now, for a country the size of the United States, that was useful, but it really didn't change the strategic math. That was then. Fast forward 8 years, and we've had breakthroughs in water management, data management, drilling technology. And the US is now one of the lowest cost producers in the world. And as of the first of the year, we were net oil exporters. Now, COVID is scrambling all the data, so we're going to have to take another look at this in a few months once things calm down. But the United States is here to stay as a major oil producer, as a net exporter, and it's not like these technologies are going to be uninvented. This is the new normal. The US really doesn't need the rest of the world to keep the lights on, but California does. California is the only state in the lower 48 that is not participating in the shale revolution in some way. It is now, of the states, the single largest oil importer. Two-thirds of the oil that California uses is imported. About half of that comes from the Persian Gulf, which means that California is now the most energy insecure state. And if there was any sort of shock that interrupted oil production globally, most of the United States would reorganize on the shale sector, which would keep energy prices low and calm, whereas California would be the only state that would still be forced to go out into the international market to source an ever more volatile and ever smaller energy supply. There is an energy crisis in the United States, but it's only for California. Now, the other side of the shale revolution isn't with oil, it's with natural gas. Now, what we've got here is something I'll call the checkbook map, because every dot is somewhere where someone can pay the power bill. The most important concentration of checkbooks in human history is this dot right here. This is Marshalltown, Iowa. This is where I'm from. And this is not a rave. Western North Dakota, I don't think so. Now, what's going on here is a problem disconnect with transport. Now, oil is a liquid. You can put it into a bucket, you can put it into a rail car, you can put it into a barge, you can put it into almost any sort of container. And if you can't move it that day, you'll just put it into a holding tank. It's not going to move anywhere on you. But you can't do that with natural gas. It's a gas, it disperses. So you have to have a pressurized collection, transport, and usage system that's leak free that can process the end product just as fast as it comes in because you almost can't store it anywhere. Now, here in the United States, we've got the world's largest and most versatile natural gas distribution system, but we can barely keep up with what's coming up out of the shale oil fields as a byproduct. So, until we can build out the infrastructure, we have to flare it. And you can see those flares from space. Now, what that means is that the United States is now the world's largest supplier of natural gas. And that has driven the price of the stuff well below what you would expect market norms to be. What can't you do with an endless supply of it? We've retooled our entire industrial sector, especially in petrochem, to use natural gas whenever possible. So we're not using as much oil. We're not even using as much electricity, and that's made the U.S. That has made the United States the lowest cost supplier for all of the chemical inputs that are a basis for everyday life. And of course, the least creative but most important way right now that we're using all this extra natural gas is burning it for electricity. What we've got here is average power prices in the United States for all folks, whether it's residential, industrial, or otherwise. And you'll see that about 10 years ago, when the shale revolution began, power prices more or less flatlined. Since then, we've seen no significant increase in power prices, and the US now has the cheapest electricity in the world without even using subsidies. You can look at specific states to give an idea of how it's different around the country. This is New York, where it is illegal to produce natural gas in any appreciable volume, but they have no problem importing it from next door in Pennsylvania. And then here is Texas, where, of course, it's wildly legal to produce the stuff, and they have seen power prices drop by about 30% in the last decade, among the lowest in the country now. But here's California. California is the only state in the lower 48 that is not participating in the shale revolution in some way. They're not using the technologies to produce locally, and the pipelines that bring natural gas in from the rest of the country have been at max capacity for quite some time. So California now has the highest electricity prices in the lower 48. They're going up, and they're probably going to be going up for at least the next 25 to 30 years. After that, we'll have to see what happens with technology. But it does put California at a competitive disadvantage versus the rest of the country. And then there's the issue of transport. Now, back during the 1980s, the Iranians and the Iraqis were involved in a bitter war. And by the time we got to 1985, that war on land had reached a stalemate. So they started throwing missiles at each other's commercial shipping. In this tanker war, 300 vessels were hit, 50 were disabled, and about a dozen were sunk. That almost destroyed the global insurance industry because no one had ever made allotments for damage to commercial shipping, which is normally a low risk venture, on that scale. And it changed the way we insure vessels. Today, if you want to insure your vessel, you have to pay for an annual premium about 2.5% the value of your vessel. That assumes you never sail into a conflict zone. Should you sail into a conflict zone, the price of that insurance increases by a factor of 100 to be paid out every week. That assumes no one shoots at any commercial shipping. Should someone be taking pot shots at commercial vessels, your policy evaporates. It's null and void. So, the first time in this post America world where shipping is targeted, you can guarantee that no one is going to be sailing anywhere near these conflict zones. That's 3/4 of manufacturing supply chain steps, 3/4 of global agricultural shipments, and 3/4 of global energy supplies. Gone. Now, for most Americans, this is a minor issue. Most of our trade is within the Western Hemisphere. In fact, half of our trade is just with Canada and Mexico. Doesn't have to sail in the deep blue sea. But that's not the case for California. California isn't just the state most dependent upon trade with East Asia, it's the trade gateway, has lots of throughput, all of which sails the deep blue sea. You can get an idea of where some of these exposures specifically lie when you look at manufacturing chains. The 1555 in the middle of this graphic is total value added manufacturing within the United States. And all the circles and arrows on the outside pointing in are where all the components come from. The 1555 in the middle of this graphic indicates the total of value added manufacturing in the United States. That 1555, that's $1.555 trillion. All of the circles and arrows that flow in from the outside indicate the value in billions, and then the color indicates the likelihood it's going to be disrupted in this world that we're moving into. Green means it's probably fine. Yellow means figure 25% of it's not going to make it. Orange is half, and red means just don't count on it at all. It's not going to show up. Now, you'll notice for the United States that there's a lot of green, a fair amount of yellow, and no red. That doesn't mean that the United States is immune to what's coming, but it's something we can grow through. It's something we can manage. By the way, the state that's most exposed to all of this in absolute terms is Texas, but most of that exposure is via Mexico, so that's probably fine. It's not fine for the Germans. The Germans are much more dependent upon the countries that they border and especially on countries beyond the horizon for their value add. In addition, because they have the world's second most rapidly aging demography, they are wildly dependent on countries beyond the horizon to purchase the end product. There's nothing about the German system that can work without American security overwatch. But that's nothing compared to what the Chinese are facing. The Chinese are completely dependent on high tech from other sources. Now, I'm sure that you have heard the Made in China 2025 program, the idea that China is seeking technological parity with the United States in just 5 years. If you talk to any Chinese bureaucrat behind closed doors where their minder is not listening, it'll become pretty obvious to you that 2025 is really just the first step. They don't expect true parity until at least 2070. They don't have that kind of time. Now, some version of this holds true. Obviously, especially in manufacturing, the US is very well positioned for the low end. The shale revolution and low transport costs to end consumers bodes very well for American low end manufacturers. And the US is also well positioned on the high end. The US has the capital, the tech, and the labor force. And within manufacturing, there are two subsectors that are very heavily exposed to this. The first is automotive, but about two-thirds of that is within NAFTA. That's manageable. The bigger concern is the second one, technology manufacturing. About two-thirds of that is in East Asia. And we'll come back to that in just a minute. First, we have to have an idea of the decision-making process here. If this were just about energy and markets and transport and resources and finance, everybody would be handing to the United States. But it's not. It's also about coronavirus. No one knows precisely how long the pandemic will last or in what order it will end, and this graphic gives you an idea of why. You can see the United States, the blue line, has never really recovered from our first wave, and we're already starting to gear up for something worse. The European Union did recover from their first wave, but they're already back to their first wave highs and are actually seeing a number of states like Spain that are already suffering new infection rates that are worse than what we have here in the United States. The Middle East and the Latin American countries are on the whole as bad or worse than what's going on here in the United States. So you've got to decide what matters. If you were already looking to escape from China in 2019, whether it's because of human rights or information security or the police state or what's going on in Hong Kong or the genocide in Zhejiang, coronavirus only confirms your decision and you accelerate your own extraction. But if you were hanging on due to sunk costs, you're probably going to wait to be forced by circumstances or governments. And for the most part, that's the view of Silicon Valley. They have bet their entire existence on globalization. Nearly their entire manufacturing chain is in East Asia, and very little of that is going to last, which means that when they do move, when they are forced to move, it will all move at once. Potential recipient locations who are ready for that can inherit 50 years of supply chain expansion almost overnight. And potential recipient locations who cannot will get nothing. Why am I specifically mentioning Silicon Valley and computing manufacturing? Personally, I think semiconductor manufacturing would be a great fit for Santa Clarita. Now, we've talked about energy and transport and finance already. Let's look at some of the peculiarities of your geography and give you an idea of what that means for your possibilities. Let's start with a population density map. As you can see, California's population centers are not simply isolated from Canada and Mexico. They're separated from the US writ large and even from other major West Coast population centers. You zoom in a little bit and you can see that the Los Angeles basin isn't simply separated from the West Coast, it's broken off from the rest of California itself. Zoom in a little bit more. The various lobes of the LA basin are largely on their own. And even within the various lobes, there really isn't much of a transport network. It's pretty wretched. The population footprint is too dense to function without mass transit. And as you all know, there's really no mass transit within Los Angeles. I'm sure you've all sat in LA traffic for far more of your life than you would have liked to. So California is not participating in the shale revolution. So you should pencil in ever rising power prices and a sustained energy crisis. California is not part of the American, much less the North American transport network, so it cannot generate economies of scale. Los Angeles cannot even generate economies of scale within LA. This all urges California to use its ocean frontage to integrate with places over the horizon. But unfortunately, that pattern is collapsing. And of course, Santa Clarita itself is largely hived off from the rest of LA. That means that Santa Clarita cannot compete in anything that requires cheap or reliable transport. You also cannot compete in anything that's low margin because you can never achieve economies of scale. You must move up the value added chain as far and as quickly as possible. So let's look at what COVID and deglobalization are making available. Every industry has its own characteristics, but review what we know. Finance will become more difficult, but not in the US. Complex supply chains are going away, but the United States writ large does not need to worry about transport. The United States has the best skilled labor market in the world, and skilled labor is mobile. Proximity to markets is key, and the United States is the market that matters. And large industry relocations will require large greenfield footprints. With that in mind, I see six subsectors of manufacturing that are going to relocate to the United States in large scale. The first, top left, is automotive. The automotive industry is one of the most complex in the world. Everyone builds a little bit of everything. But what coronavirus plus the trade war have done is they've disrupted these complex supply chain systems. Combine that with shale lowering local costs, and a lot of this has already moved back and more will in the year to come. Second, electronics, the bottom left. Kind of like automotive, everyone produces a lot of everything, but there's nothing really secretive about it. There's no real technological breakthroughs that people are trying to predict. That means it's easier to relocate than automotive because you don't have to worry about intellectual property to the same degree. Third, heavy machinery, top one, top center. This is one of those that is going to move very, very quickly. It's similar to automotive, but it's a lot more concentrated because not everybody needs a forklift. Now, there's a clause in the new NAFTA agreement that mandates that 80% of components must come from within North America. Here in the United States, we've largely outsourced that entire sector to China since the year 2000. It's all coming roaring back now. Bottom center is another one that's moving very quickly, wiring. The shale revolution has pushed production costs because of energy through the floor. Once you have the ore, you have to smelt it into an ingot and then pull it into a wire. Those are very energy intensive states, which means the United States is now the low cost producer. Top right's a fun one that nobody really saw coming, textiles. The technology of automated yarn spinning and cloth weaving and cutting is now cheaper than doing it with human labor in places like India and Bangladesh. We're going to see that industry writ large move back to the West. None of these five are what I would consider perfect for Santa Clarita. You don't really have a competitive advantage in land, labor, or energy. But the last one, the bottom right, semiconductors, that just might be for you. Now, some parts of the computing supply chain can be relocated right now. Motherboards, flash drives, final computer assembly, putting together things that are made from microchips. That's all currently in Thailand and China, and all of those facilities are already looking for new locations more appropriate to the world that we are entering. For the steps that can't be automated, where you still need human eyes and fingers, Mexico is a solid candidate. But for steps where it can be automated, the United States looks pretty good, and it might be something that Santa Clarita would want to look into. But I'm, for you, more interested in the earlier steps of the process, the manufacturing of the chips themselves. These four photos kind of give you the rough idea of how it works. In the bottom right, you start with silicon powder and you melt it down and draw it into a crystal. You slice it into thin wafers. Those wafers in the top right are then doped and baked to form the pathways that electrons follow in the semiconductors. You then get the top left, a big old disk with dozens, if not hundreds, of these kind of pre chip materials. And those are broken apart in the bottom left and installed into chip formats that can then be used in any sort of computer process. The fun part about this is that this is all done in independent countries, individual countries. But the really fun part is all of this, from the drawing of the crystals to the doping and baking of the chips to the breaking apart and the making of the microprocessors themselves. It's all done in the same facility. It's a clean room issue. It all has to be done under the same roof. Now, relocating a semiconductor fabrication facility isn't something to be done lightly or quickly. Those are multi-billion-dollar facilities. But I encourage you to think big, because these fab facilities are going to have to move. Give you an idea of the speed. All these shifts in manufacturing are not simply a forecast. This break from China is already underway. This graphic shows how fast things have moved to this point. The slider indicates what has left or come to China or other locations in the last couple of years. The blue is for China specifically, and the further left the slider is, the greater the percentage of total inputs that are now coming from somewhere else. There are a few subcategories here to pay attention to. First, these three categories are one where US shale is likely to predominate and is driving the change. Second, it's a largely regulatory issue, places where Team Lightheider has forced changes into the treaty, which preferences North American production. Third are areas where Team Lightheider has basically thrown tariffs on China and encouraged companies to relocate anyway. And then finally, there's the issue of cost in China rising, primarily, although not exclusively, due to rising labor costs. Now, in the industry where the Chinese have managed to maintain market share, energy, chemicals, agriculture, these are primarily industries in which there's a degree of heavy industrial legacy plant. You don't want to move this stuff. It's like a major refinery, a major chemicals plant. And it takes time to build the new infrastructure. But the United States is the world's cheapest producer of natural gas, which is the primary input for most of these processes. So all of this is going to move, and it just takes a little bit of time for the United States to build out the industrial infrastructure. That is already happening. That was happening before coronavirus. That was happening before the trade war. So all of this is going to vanish in relatively short order. Second, the industries where China is losing market share most quickly: furniture, electronics, machinery. All of those are industries where incremental shifts are viable. If you have a car that has 3,000 parts, well, you can make two or three in a different location. But the more parts you build in other locations, the more you've established an alternate production system elsewhere. It's an accelerating process. Most independent estimates project today that operational costs for manufacturing in North America in every manufacturing sector is now lower than pre-existing China-centric Asian manufacturing. Now, that doesn't mean you can just flip a switch. You still have to build the industrial plant in the United States. That is not free. But if you know that the end result of this is a better operating environment, the case is being made industry by industry that it's time to go. Just in calendar year 2019, we had a 20% reduction in the shipments from China to the United States for value added manufacturing components. It is all moving. So let's cross some T's and dot some I's when it comes to semiconductors. The fab facilities are big. They require big investment and a lot of political capital. They don't move lightly, but they do move, and they are starting to. These large fab facilities is what I think Santa Clarita should go after because it's about finance and labor as opposed to power prices. It plays to America's strengths and it plays to your strengths while ignoring most of the weaknesses that make other manufacturing efforts a reach for the area. You can tap the labor pool of Silicon Valley. You can tap the labor pool of greater Los Angeles without suffering from their transport weaknesses. And financing for something of this size will never be easier. Since coronavirus started, the US has already picked up its first new fab facility. It went to Phoenix. But there's another reason that I think you should target tech and tech manufacturing. Silicon Valley is about to get its butt handed to it. The Valley has placed all of its eggs in the globalization basket. Its entire manufacturing system is Asia centric, and it will lose its entire China footprint. These facilities must move. But better for you, Silicon Valley has lost its political cover here in the United States across the political spectrum. Now, the center left originally loved Silicon Valley because they were corporate titans with social agendas, remaking corporate America from within, or at least that's how the love affair started. But as information transmission became free, anything that impinged upon that transmission, upon that information flow, like, say, fact checking, Silicon Valley resisted to the end. The Valley continued to disavow responsibility even when ISIS was beheading Americans on their IT platforms, even when posts were blaming California's wildfires on Antifa. The center left hasn't simply dropped its support for Silicon Valley. It now sees the Valley as a threat to democracy itself. Very top of the list of people who matter, California's own Senator, Dianne Feinstein. What about the center right? The center right used to laud the Valley as an example of what Americans could achieve in a low regulation environment with a new technology. But then Silicon Valley CEOs let their personal political views not simply shape corporate policy, but much of the Valley committed to never working for the government for anything. Most notably, though, for the intelligence community and the Defense Department. But their services were still fully available for sale. So their work could benefit the militaries and civilian monitoring programs of Russia and China. In particular, the same companies that refused to work with the US government helped build the nuts and bolts of the monitoring system that allowed China's genocide in Xinjiang. So the center right now doesn't merely question the Valley's ideology or even their patriotism, but their sanity. What's left of the American pro business party is now anti Silicon Valley. Now, as much credence as there is to the points of the center left and the center right, and I broadly agree with both, the concerns of America's political extremists are actually even more valid. Simply put, for the radical right, it's Main Street versus Wall Street. The populist right thinks of Silicon Valley as the greatest job destroying machine in American history, and they are actually correct. But so's the radical left. Algorithms and robots don't pay taxes, but their output accrues to the operators and designers. The populist left views Silicon Valley as the top reason for America's wealth inequality, and they are right. The solution for all four factions, is to revoke the Valley's unlimited license and enact some sort of constraining regulation. Everyone wants to break Silicon Valley's power. Everyone wants to repatriate tech manufacturing. And Silicon Valley doesn't have the cost structure or the physical room or the labor force to bring the manufacturing base to the Valley in specific or even the Bay Area in general. It has to go somewhere else. Enter Santa Clarita. It's going to happen fast when it happens. But I do want to end with one final point because it might happen even faster than any of us has ever dreamed or feared. And that has to do with American culture. This is how most Americans think of themselves. The pioneer era. This is our national myth. The idea that you could go out, you could start new. And with 6 months after starting a new plow, you could be exporting grain down the greater Mississippi to sell to Europe for a high amount of cash. The can do attitude, this is the source of it. But it does have a dark side because for 150 years, Americans saw their lives get better every single day. That's not normal. It was normal for us, but it's not normal. Sometimes the world punches you in the face. Sometimes you don't expect the change. And while other countries will take that in stride, while other cultures can adapt to such rapid shifts, we in the United States aren't very good at that. We think that the covenant with God has been broken. We think that the sky is going to fall. And when the world does touch us on its terms instead of ours, we panic. Now, if you're looking for someone to blame for this, oops, wrong way. I blame Canada because they were the first ones to do to us. Back in the War of 1812, they burned down our capital. Kind of a dick move, not something a good neighbor does. And as a result, we started on this pattern of reaction and overreaction. We've done it about 8 times in our history, every couple of generations. A few quick examples. 9/11 is probably the best one that's on everybody's mind right now. 3,000 dead, terrorist attack that came out of nowhere. As a side effect of our reaction to 9/11, we now have the sharp end of American power stationed on either side of every major trade and energy artery on the planet. My personal favorite is Sputnik, the beeping aluminum grapefruit. We were the head of the Russians in electronics, metallurgy, rocketry, but we wanted to make sure that whatever we threw up there was going to last. The Soviets didn't care. They just wanted to beat us to that one line. So the Sputnik went up, and 90 days later, it fell out of orbit. About the time it fell out of orbit, we launched our first satellite, Vanguard 1. It's still up there. We, however, retooled in a panic our entire industrial and educational base as a result of Sputnik. We coasted on that for 40 years. Well, folks, 9/11 was 19 years ago this month. We are going through some of the greatest changes human history has ever seen right now. To think that we're going to make it through the next few years without some sort of weird shock, I think is naive. And what's different this time is that the United States really doesn't care what the world looks like the next day. And if you think demographic shifts, the collapse of the order, and COVID are forcing rapid changes, that's nothing compared to what would happen if the United States actually went out there and knocked over the anthill. All right, that's a lot for an hour. If you're looking for a little bit more of some suggestions, accidental superpowers, how it all started, why Americans care about what they care about, and what they're going to care about in the years to come. Absent picks up where accidental left off, launches off with the shale revolution, and plays into the military conflicts that will erupt around the world in America's absence. And then finally, Disunited Nations came out earlier this year, and it talks about why the countries that we think are the countries of the future aren't, and who actually will be headlining in the decades to come.
Wow, Peter, absolutely amazing and so much content as always. So thank you for that. I'd like to go into a little bit of Q&A. And not quite sure where to start, but let me cover, maybe give you a couple of broad topics and let you react to that. So you talked about opportunities for Santa Clarita, issues in California, and we've talked about COVID. What do you think about onshoring and what happens in the field of biotech and onshoring related to pharmaceuticals and other technology and opportunities in that area?
Let me kind of break that down into 2 topics because there's 2 very different angles. The first is the relatively low end, the drug manufacturing itself. Products that, for the most part, have been outsourced to the wider world over the course of the last 30 years, prescription drugs, for example. About 95% of our normal prescription drugs are produced in other countries, most notably India and China. And one of the things that we have found out during coronavirus is, maybe this is something we're not too thrilled with in terms of arrangements. Now, what is going to happen over the next few months is we're going to have a vaccine for coronavirus, and we're going to have to manufacture it at volume. And every country that can manufacture it is undoubtedly going to try, excuse me, to keep as many of those doses within their own national borders as possible. That is going to light a fire under the American people and under Congress to change the way that we do drug manufacture. And a lot of that is going to be forced to come back to the United States. That is honestly, whoever the first mover is on that in the United States is going to get most of it. Santa Clarita could go for that. I'm not sure you've got the massive competitive advantage there, but it is something to consider. The second piece, and I think something that you are probably better positioned for, is going for the higher end, the research and development of new drugs in the first place. Santa Clarita already has a reasonably large medical devices industry. Tijuana, which also has one, is not that far away. And partnership with universities and hospitals does not require immediate proximity. That is something where you already have some of the institutional and labor infrastructure in place that you can naturally expand into related sectors like drug development, especially things like biologics.
So let's pick up on what you said there about the energy situation. You talked extensively about what's happening in California and the instability that we still import. What recommendations would you make? There's a lot of talk about going to everything being electrified here in California. You talked a little bit about gas and how it's produced. So, what would be your advice to control energy costs? And we have companies here that are some of the best producers of oil and gas. How do we support them, and how do we try to set us on the right course here?
Well, I think we're past the point of advice. California has made a decision that is very expensive, that is going to drive energy prices up for the long term. The goal of electrifying everything is, interesting from my point of view as a developmental specialist, but that means you need to not simply change your entire infrastructure for how you use power and how you distribute power, but you're going to have to expand your ability to generate electricity by at least a factor of 4. Powering everything with electricity means you have to have more electricity. And if you're going to do that with solar and wind, you also then have to have a storage system for the entire state, which honestly uses more lithium than the world can produce in a decade. That's going to drive prices up. That decision has been made. However, I don't mean to be a complete downer, because the bureaucrats in Sacramento have been pretty good about being flexible with their standards. They do recognize that the technology to achieve some of these goals doesn't exist yet, and there is wiggle room. But it means that for Santa Clarita, you cannot count on anything but power prices going up for the foreseeable future. And that limits the sort of industries you can participate in. Now, personally, I don't think that's a death knell. It just means you have to go in value added wherever you can, so that electricity prices, power prices, just like transport prices, are such a small component of the end product that it kind of gets washed out.
Didn't see that coming, Peter. So thank you again for your time, your thought-provoking comments, and we look forward to hearing from you again soon.
My pleasure.